Welcome to Migdal Dialogues, a podcast from Yeshivat Migdal HaTorah. My name is Jonathan Ziering. I'm a Rebbe at Migdal.
And I'm Rabbi Aryeh Sklar. I'm a Rebbe at Migdal as well.
As we discussed in our first podcast, our goal here is to bring you the types of conversations we have at Migdal about the big questions, to highlight how we think about these questions, what we think about these questions, and to bring you into the conversation. And today I'm really excited to have Rabbi Sklar with us because Rabbi Sklar has spent the last few years translating a book by Rav Kook, L'Nevuchei Hador, which, as he will explain, focuses on the types of questions that we talk about here at Migdal. So, Rabbi Sklar, can you tell us what L'Nevuchei Hador is and why you think it was such an important book to translate and what it contributes for the modern reader?
Sure. So the words L'Nevuchei Hador means literally for the perplexed of the generation. That kind of reminds you of Moreh HaNevuchim, the Rambam's text of philosophy called The Guide for the Perplexed or Of the Perplexed. And Rav Kook never actually called it that, although in the first few chapters he talks about the Nevuchim, the perplexed, and he's clearly calling back to the Rambam.
Who did call it L'Nevuchei Hador?
It seems to be Rav Tzvi Yehuda, his son, and the students. There are others who called it Moreh Nevuchim HaChadash, which clearly is a reference to the Rambam and calling it the new Guide for the Perplexed. But L'Nevuchei Hador seems to be the title of it ever since it was published not that long ago, around 2010 or so. It's one of those rare books which we get a glimpse into Rav Kook before the editing process and after the editing process, because it was somehow leaked onto the internet. It became a little bit of a firestorm, and you got to see some of those maybe more controversial, really out there type of opinions that Rav Kook had, that sometimes when his students and his followers published his works would kind of elide and remove from the public eye so that people wouldn't be confused about this great figure, Rabbi Kook, and what he actually believes.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing about some of his positions. But before we get there, can you tell me how you first became interested in this book, or Rav Kook in general, before we tackle some of the questions that he actually raises in L'Nevuchei Hador?
I'll even go further back than that, and I'll tell you a little bit of a crisis that I had when I was in high school. I went to a yeshiva called Yeshiva of Virginia in Richmond, Virginia. It was a high school, boarding school. The Rosh Yeshiva there happens to be the Rosh Yeshiva Emeritus of Migdal HaTorah, Rabbi Chaim Ozer Chait. And if you know anything about the Chaits, there's a certain kind of philosophy of the Rambam, a certain rationalist bent that was promoted in the yeshiva, certainly taught as part of Rabbi Chait's shir. And it created a certain amount of confusion, not intentionally, but because I grew up in the Five Towns in Cedarhurst, and throughout my life had heard a kind of Hasidic, neo-Hasidic, maybe you call it nowadays, or maybe more mystically bent, more midrashic, I don't know these are the right words, but a less rationalist type of understanding of Judaism, of halacha and the halachic process. It created a certain amount of crisis in me, a conflict between my background and what I was learning in the yeshiva. And I knew...
So you started reading L'Nevuchei Hador in high school?
I did not start...
Okay.
I know, I'm starting in the background. I'm starting...
Okay, because I wasn't sure where that was going, but I've learned some L'Nevuchei Hador, but that was under Rabbi Carmi's guidance in college, and I will be honest that I still struggled. So you scared me a little bit when you said you were starting that in high school, but okay, go on.
It wouldn't have made sense either because it was only published much later than when I was in high school.
That is true.
But that crisis of kind of like the rationalist side and maybe what I would call maybe a mystically bent side of my Judaism came to a head in yeshiva, where I was seeing both of these and realizing that they're kind of inseparable. The Rambam approach, maybe we would call it, versus the Ramban approach. Maybe that's not the completely accurate description, but
let's clarify that for a little bit. I know it's not central to our story, but the Rambam, meaning the person,
yes,
who's often identified with the more rationalist strain in Judaism. And the Ramban, despite certain rationalist tendencies in terms of a scientific approach, him also being a doctor, but is also one of the, I don't know, fathers, but is also well known as a Kabbalist. So therefore is associated with the mystical world, if that's what you mean.
Exactly
Okay.
Exactly what I'm saying. And realizing that these are kind of inseparable kind of pieces of what Judaism is. And how do I deal with that? How does somebody deal with these kind of seemingly extremely opposite approaches as a singular Jew.
So you started solving these problems in high school?
So once I got to yeshiva, I really realized that I can't remove one from the other and say, okay, I'm a rationalist, and therefore I'm just going to keep rationalist halacha, because so much of our tefillot, so much of our minhagim are based in the paradigms of the Kabbalah and mysticism in general. And that created, what do? Should I not be what the standard common halachic practices are? Should I not act that way? Or should I just choose one and not the other?
So how did this bring you to Rav Kook?
Oh, very good. So in Shana Aleph, I realized that issue. Shana Bet, I started really trying to figure it out, trying to figure out how I can make this resolution. And I still didn't feel that I completely got there, that I can bring the two together. It was when I came back as a madrich, and I specifically learned with one of the Rebbeim in yeshiva, Rabbi Pesach Uliki, we learned this one text that had just come out, L'nevuchei Ador. And through it, I discovered that there is a way to kind of bring both sides together, that some way, somehow, two opposites can attract and be together.
You know, as you say that, and I think about the years before I let you go on, it just makes me realize that when I took the course on Rav Kook in YU, it was probably the year L'nevuchei Hador had come out. I never appreciated how amazing it was that Roy Carmi had already processed it and knew all the key passages to show us to try to get ideas from Rav Kook. But if you know Rabbi Carmi, that makes sense.
Very cool. Yeah. I've asked him questions in the past about L'nevuchei Hador. We've had conversations about it. And so through that text, it created a resolution in my head of almost like non-resolution, meaning that both work together and are two truths that are at loggerheads, but at the same time united. And we'll have to talk about how that could possibly be true.
So let's talk about it. You just said that there are two truths that are somehow at loggerheads. Now, my training is a little bit more in formal philosophy, but you don't need to know much philosophy to know that the first rule of philosophy is the rule of non-contradiction, that something and its opposite can't both be true. And what you're telling me is that your resolution to these problems came from the insight that something can be true and so can its opposite. So I'm going to need you to explain that, but why don't you take an example, take a question that Rav Kook deals with, why it's important, and try to explain to me. I have trouble with Rav Kook, so go slowly, and explain to me what exactly you think Rav Kook does to deal with these questions and how he possibly makes sense of what you're telling me are two truths that are opposite and yet also true at the same time.
Okay, absolutely. So one of the issues that Rav Kook deals with early on in the book is a question of determinism, which is a classic philosophical question. Is everything determined in life? Is there free will? And if there is not, then what's the purpose of religion? What would be the purpose of reward and punishment? Can there be justice if we're forced to?
This is definitely a question that gets asked in Migdal. I don't know how often, but yes, the question of free will is definitely central to giving meaning to our life and definitely meaning to a religious life.
And what's interesting is it's not just a philosophical question, or rather it's not just theory, but it's actually a scientific question, which goes to the very foundation of science. Stephen Hawking actually talks about this in a lecture that he gave in 1999, which was about this question of determinism and Einstein's theory of relativity, if it helps at all with determinism.
I assume what you mean is his claim that because the theory of relativity says that everything is relative, so therefore, there's a little bit more flexibility in reality, and maybe that gives us room for free will.
Exactly. And there is also the foundations of quantum mechanics, which allows for perhaps a little bit more randomness in reality than we see in the cause and effect of
That's
life.
Definitely become more popular in the last few years, right? The more we believe that at the core of reality, there is randomness. So in theory, if you need randomness to give meaning to free will, so then quantum mechanics may help you, depending on what we learn about quantum mechanics, which that's anybody's guess.
So exactly. Stephen
if you
Hawking
have theories, you're free to let me know. If it's better than string theory and quantum loop theory, then please let all of us know.
I'm already, that's beyond me already. But Stephen Hawking actually doesn't think it answers the question at all, or it doesn't help, because he thinks that underneath it all, there would be rules and we just don't know them yet. The randomness just seems random to us.
So if there are rules for everything, the scientific question you're bringing up now for free will is if everything has rules and rules and rules built on rules down to the very bottom of reality, So that means that there must be also a rule to what you are doing. It must be predictive, because if I know the rule in A and I know the rule for B and I know how A follows from B and I can follow that chain forever, as long as I knew everything in theory, I would know what you're going to do, right? That's the problem you're dealing with, is how can you say there's free will when modern science might tell us that there are explanatory rules all the way down. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay,
And it's something that he talks about Laplace. Laplace was a French philosopher and scientist. They call it Laplace's demon. I forget exactly why it's called a demon. Maybe it's something bad.
Because philosophers love demons. They love demons, and they love multiverses, and they love everything that sounds exciting.
It does sound exciting. Laplace theorized that if we knew all the rules, if we could figure out all the rules of science of why this is reacting to that and that is reacting to this and the cause and effect of everything, we'd be able to predict things from the beginning of time to the end of time. We'd be able to figure out how it all works.
So if this demon exists and we can predict everything from the beginning of time, so then free will should not exist, and yet we feel like we have free will, and religion doesn't really make sense unless there's free will, because then what is the value to making choices if you're not really making them, right? That's the problem we're dealing with.
Indeed. So now we've established there's a scientific problem, there's a philosophical problem, and then there's a theological problem, which is that where does God fit in if everything is determined? What would be the purpose of God's existence? Or what would God be able to do?
I think this is why it's a demon. Right? The demon has created a problem in science, in philosophy, in morality, and in theology. That does seem demonic.
It's a major problem, and Stephen Hawking says that determinism, the belief that everything has a cause and effect, is the foundation of science today. So if you are a scientist, he believes, you have to have a foundational belief in determinism, because otherwise, how can you do science? You could just say tomorrow might be different than today. That's
so basically, if you believe Stephen Hawking, to believe in science is to not believe in free will, and if to believe in religion, and religion being meaningful, is to believe in free will, then you cannot both believe in science and religion.
We have a problem, right?
We have a problem, and I got the problem. Okay, so what is Rav Kook's solution, and how does he think about these problems? Because there are a lot of solutions to these problems. Obviously, you could take them locally, and you could say that Stephen Hawking, with all due respect, his analysis of science is incorrect, and you don't need to understand science as radically, or you could tackle free will and try to understand how it really works with this. But you're telling me that Rav Kook doesn't take these localized approaches. Rav Kook has a different way of thinking. So let's leave all those theoretical possibilities on the side and tell me, what is it that Rav Kook does that's unique about thinking about these issues?
Okay, so with a little bit of background, I think is necessary as well. Rav Kook actually writes in a letter a completely different approach than maybe what you've seen. Usually we reject a theory that conflicts with the Torah. We would say, okay, let's reject it. Certainly that's what maybe we would call a more Haredi approach. I went to a lecture by Rabbi Menachem Leibtag about biblical criticism, which we might be able to
He's
talk.
He's not Haredi, for the record.
He's not Haredi, very much not. And he talks about two basic approaches that you'll find in Judaism, that two issues of science, philosophy, etc., with the Torah, these seeming conflicts. There's the isolationist approach, which is to say, let's not hear about it and let's reject it out of hand. It doesn't seem to work with the Torah. I don't want to try to figure it out, and it's not worth it. Maybe there's practical issues. Maybe if somebody hears about it, they don't seem to have a good answer. They'll go off the derech, or you won't be able to convince people. You won't be able to even come up with a good answer for it, maybe.
Okay, so I get that approach. You're committed to Judaism. There's something that might challenge your Judaism. Don't think about it. Don't care about it. Live your life. Okay, that's approach one. What's approach two?
The second approach that Rabbi Leibtag identifies is called inoculation. Not isolation, but inoculation, which is that you learn about it. By learning about it, you can come up with the answers, or smart people can spend the time thinking of the answers. And through seeing, let's say, you going to a museum and seeing dinosaurs in that museum, and then the kids ask questions, how does the Torah not talk about dinosaurs? Well, it doesn't seem like they exist. And then the teachers and parents give them answers or talk to them about it. It's not a shock when they discover dinosaurs later in life, because they've learned about it already. They've been inoculated.
By inoculated, if I understand you correctly, what you mean is you learned about what could be a problem, and it's been explained to you that it's definitely not a problem.
either it's been explained, or at the very least that you're aware of the problem and that rabbis or teachers or parents have not been bothered by that problem.
So those aren't the same.
That's true.
Right? Those aren't the same. You've now really presented, I know you've divided into two, but you've really presented three views. Where you said one is to not deal with questions that could challenge you. The other extreme would be to make sure that you have a ready-made answer for things that might bother you. And then this middle approach is to understand that people have seen the same questions and it hasn't shaken their faith. Now, that doesn't mean you necessarily have answers.
That's true.
So we have these two approaches, or maybe the three approaches. We came to talk about Rav Kook, so let's talk about Rav Kook. So tell me, how does Rav Kook deal with it? If it's not these two approaches, then tell me, what does he do to deal with a problem like determinism? He doesn't inoculate. He doesn't isolate. What does he do?
Okay, so what he says is that when we have a scientific or a philosophical problem with Judaism, that it seems to be in conflict, what we have to do is accept the approach and see if it can work with Judaism. Meaning to say, does this conflict? Does this actually conflict once I kind of broaden my scope? Once I say, is this actually at loggerheads with a principle of faith, for example?
Okay, so let me get this straight. And this goes back to what I was asking about inoculate, right? Inoculate, I said, is to go into a question and already have a ready-made answer. And Rav Kook says, if I understand you correctly, is to say, no, let's play it out. Let's say we accepted this belief that might be heretical and might challenge the principles of Judaism, but it might not. Let's play it out. Can we imagine a Judaism that incorporates this belief? And can we come up with a conception of Judaism that would be different than maybe the one we have, but one that would still work?
Precisely.
Okay, good. So how does he do that with this?
Okay. So with the problem of determinism, for example, in the first chapter of L'Nevuchador, so you just have to open the book. It's a very difficult chapter because these are heavy philosophical concepts.
You're telling me.
Yes. And the fourth chapter as well. So he returns to it, maybe rethinking some of the ideas there. Rav Kook says that, okay, does it actually conflict with Judaism to say that the world is determined? Now you say, obviously, of course, it does conflict because there's no free will. He says,
definitely sounds like it.
Well, what if there's free will as part of the determined system? What if we can just say that there's a certain amount of free will that the natural cause and effect system wants to have? Why would it have it? Why would it be created that way? I don't think he really gets into. He believes that the world is reaching a perfected point, that history of the world, of the universe, is actually one, and this is obviously coming from the more Kabbalistic aspects of Rav Kook's belief. You have to accept this or not accept this. It's like one of his axioms, that the world is created as a kind of a point, let's call it a Big Bang, that's supposed to return to the smallest point again, the most simple point. It's a breaking
oscillating
apart
universe. It started with a Big Bang and it's going back to that singularity.
And of course, he didn't know about the Big Bang yet. It was towards the end of his life, I think, that it was even suggested, and certainly wasn't popularized when he was alive. He died in 1935.
But he thinks Kabbalistically there was a Big Bang.
Yeah, right. And
okay.
You could see
we have
that
now coined a new phrase, the Kabbalistic Bang.
The Kabbalistic Big Bang, which Gerald Schroeder talks about in Genesis and the Big Bang. But I don't know if Rav Kook would necessarily sign on to that. Going to this state of perfection, meaning it's breaking apart. There's, in Kabbalistic terms, there's the breaking of the vessels and things like that. And then it's slowly but surely reaching a more perfect point. So there's a certain determined aspect to the universe, right? And he's allowing for that, but maybe within that perfection requires there to be a certain amount of free will. So he's trying to push towards a scientific theory, or maybe a philosophical theory, whichever way you want to see it, as okay, accept determinism on an outside level, but on the inside level, say, okay, there's a free will aspect to the determination.
So how is this different than what we said before, that you could just say, Stephen Hawking thinks that you have to be deterministic. Being deterministic denies the possibility of free will. I'm a little bit confused, right? Are you redefining determinism that it doesn't really mean determinism, right? You're just redefining that phrase, or you said something about inside, outside, right? That it sort of is, it sort of isn't. You want to explain that? I'm not understanding.
So I am paraphrasing Rav Kook here. In essence, like similar to, call it a system. The determined aspects of the system, they are going to be the way they are. But also, in addition to that, there is a law of free will. Like similar to a law or maybe a theory of gravity, there's a law of attraction.
Okay, but as we've established, determinism, at least possibly, or at least we're positing, contradicts the possibility of free will. And therefore, we're now at the law of non-contradiction. So I still don't get it. How does it not lead to a contradiction?
Right. It's hard to actually parse exactly how Rav Kook deals with every question here, but it goes something like this. Determinism requires there to be a cause and an effect for everything. Rav Kook says, yeah, on the whole, that's true, but on the particulars, there could be a certain amount of free will to get to that determined point. There's a free will law as part of nature. That's how he understands it.
So if I understand what you're saying, as much as I understand it, is Rav Kook isn't saying that X is true and X is not true. What he's saying is that there's a partial truth in determinism, and the fact that it's only a partial truth in reality leaves an opening for free will. Is that right?
I guess you can call it a partial truth. You can call it
an incomplete truth.
Okay, fine. That's a great way to put it. An incomplete truth. And Rav Kook says free will is a truth, and he establishes that. He says, first of all, it's the entire point of the Torah. It's certainly what he thinks is the Tzelem Elokim in man is free will, which really comes from the Meshech Chachma, maybe from the Sforno before him. And not everybody else says that Tzelem Elokim means that, but the idea of free will, well, if we don't have free will, what's the point of doing anything? What would we say about God? Does God have free will? There becomes these issues. So he says we have to say that free will is a truth, but also if determinism, and again, he's saying that determinism might have a basis to it. He doesn't sign on completely to determinism, but he says, does determinism necessarily conflict with free will? He says maybe if we say on the whole, on the major events that would reach to perfection, deterministic laws apply. But within those deterministic laws are also a certain amount of maybe what we would call randomness, maybe that's the wrong word, a certain amount of free will in man to allow him to reach those goals of perfection.
I always have trouble with Rav Kook, so for myself, I'm going to summarize it, and you tell me if I got it. The reason we're talking about Nevuchei Ador is because your claim is that Rav Kook has a unique way of dealing with the big questions that really challenge a modern reader. And the example we chose to talk about is determinism, is the possibility that if the whole world is controlled by rules, then how could there be any room for randomness, which at some level, a little bit of randomness is necessary for people to make decisions. Point one. Point two, some people might walk away from this question, what you call the isolationists, and just say, you know what, that sounds complicated. I'm not talking about it. I'm not thinking about it. I'm just going to be Jewish. Philosophers can think whatever they want. I don't care. Possibility two is come up with some ready-made answer. Rav Kook says, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to say, let's play a thought experiment and say, listen, I take science seriously, and it could be that science tells us that the world is deterministic, that there are rules from the bottom to the top, from the quantum level to general relativity. There are rules everywhere. And nevertheless, let me play that out and say, could there still be free will if I believe that? And Rav Kook says there can be. And even though that seems like a contradiction, what you're telling me is that Rav Kook, because of his mystical approach, is willing to embrace a theory of, I think, what we called incomplete truths or partial truths, that no matter how far-reaching a theory seems to be, it only describes a part of reality. And therefore, determinism may at some level be true. The world may at some level really have rules from the bottom to the top, but that's not the full picture of reality. There's another level which maybe you can't put your finger on, at which that's not true. And it's that level that free will exists. And even if you can't quite explain it, the belief that most theories, no matter how broad they seem, only describe one perspective of reality allows us to believe that there's a truth that animates us from determinism while not negating the truth of free will. And then I think the last point that I got here is that Rav Kook says all of this complicated theory and says, I'm not saying it because I buy it. I'm saying it because it's important to take the theories that the scientific world and the medical world and the philosophical world think are true, even though we know they might not be, but we have no choice but to at least experiment and say, can we come up with a worldview that embraces that and brings it into Judaism?
Correct. And
okay,
now,
I'm glad I got it because that may be the first time that I got a theory that complicated with Rav Kook on the first try.
now, it requires a lot of, acceptance of Rav Kook's kind of axioms. But this idea does have its downsides, right? Because if you say, well, I'm going to accept a theory and say I'm going to interpret the Torah that way, but I'm accepting the fact that it could be another scientific theory could come along and supplant it, you're basically saying that this is the modern theory that could at any point be completely substituted for another theory.
So I hear that, meaning on the one hand, what you're saying is if the value that Torah gives to our life is that it's eternal, and you're saying, but yeah, you need to try to understand the Torah in terms of whatever theory happens to come up in science or philosophy, even though you acknowledge that it's not an eternal truth or might not be true at all, you're taking away something from the eternal nature of Torah. I got it. Okay.
Exactly. So Rav Kook would respond to that, and he does in different places, that adds to the eternality of the Torah. That it's impossible for the
Now
Torah...
you're back at these contradictions.
Exactly. But this is like living in these contradictions and accepting them as incomplete truths that make a whole was something that actually really helped me to kind of deal with these conflicts in my life of the mystical approach and the rationalist approach, and say that it's possible for them to work together, or rather work apart together, which is exactly this, that Rav Kook is allowing this to possibly be true, and say that because the Torah can never conflict with truth, that any point in which we think we've reached the truth, we can make it work. And even if this isn't the truth, the next time might be the truth. And even if that's not. And so by doing this, although we have kind of removed an element of certainty from our interpretation, an element of the certainty of the eternality of this interpretation, we've established the eternality of the Torah itself.
So meaning it may not be this belief in Torah or this interpretation of Torah that is actually right and is eternal, but the only thing that is always going to be true about human life is that there's going to be uncertainty. So if I understand you correctly, the reason why this is important for Rav Kook is if the only thing that's true about human life that I know for sure is that we're never going to be fully certain, then in order to make the Torah work for all people in all times, we need to be able to embrace, or at least try to embrace, our best approximation of truth at that time. Is that right?
Exactly. And he says that we should think of ourselves as lucky that we've reached a new truth in Judaism, that hopefully this is actually true. And hopefully this will be the remainder of our interpretation of the Torah, knowing that it could possibly not be true, and that doesn't affect our faith.
Okay. Well, Aryeh Sklar, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I can see already why Rav Kook had to write a whole book about this. We've been going for a long time, but how about in 2 minutes, can you just tell us what other major topics does Rav Kook take and tackle with this type of approach, even though we really just don't have time to get into it, but at least we know what the next conversation could be about.
Sure. So early on in the book, he deals with interpretations of the first 5 chapters of Bereshit, the creation story, the Adam and Eve story, and the issue that he's dealing with, at least in the Adam and Eve story, is the problem of evolution, which is also a theory, Darwin's theory, that was already popular in the time that Rav Kook was writing this. By the way, I don't think I even ever said when he actually wrote this, which I guess at the end we'll say it was around 1904 or so. And so evolutionary theory was also a popular theory. Another issue that he deals with at length in the book is the problem of the tameh ha-mitzvot, the reasons for the mitzvot, when sometimes a reason for a mitzvah doesn't seem moral. That's an issue that he deals with, morality. And also sometimes when it doesn't seem relevant anymore. Maybe it was only applicable for a certain time.
So you dealt with evolution, the potential immorality of the Torah, and the potential irrelevance of the Torah. So you're telling me is that for each of these, to keep your model going, instead of taking the isolationist approach and not asking the questions, or coming up with ready-made answers and moving on, in each case, Rav Kook thinks the right way to approach it is to experiment and say, can I imagine a religious world which is built on these being true, and at least see what that looks like? That's what he does each time?
Let me even say that even a little bit stronger than that. He'll say that maybe this would actually, that very theory actually improves our faith in God, actually improves our interpretation of the Torah, and helps us actually understand the Torah even better.
Okay, so Aryeh Sklar, you've left us with a lot of food for thought and a lot of future conversations. So to that end, to all of you listening, please follow us on Apple, on Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts, and make sure to continue the conversation. Reach out to us at migdalatorah.org or email us at podcast@migdalattorah.org, and make sure to share with your friends so we can hear their voices also, and they can also join the conversation. Looking forward to hearing from you.